How did they run 10 kilometers across the battlefield with just one loaf of black bread and a handful of vegetables a day? A body running on empty, the opening. Picture this. It is the winter of 1942, the Eastern Front. The temperature outside is minus 30 degrees Celsius. A young German soldier, 22 years old, hasn't slept in 36 hours. He is wearing boots that are too thin for the cold, a greatcoat that is soaked through from a morning spent lying in a snow-covered ditch, and he is carrying approximately 30 kilograms of equipment. His rifle, ammunition, entrenching tool, gas mask, helmet, and a pack containing whatever personal belongings he still has. He has eaten today, but only just a hard biscuit in the morning, a small piece of canned meat at midday, the fat congealed in the cold tin like gray wax. And if he's lucky, later tonight a mess tin of thin soup ladled out from the field kitchen that moves with his unit, a mobile iron contraption the soldiers call a galashkanon, the goulash cannon. He has been told to advance across 10 kilometers of open ground before dawn. Now, picture the same scenario from a different angle. You, reading this today, probably ate more calories this morning before you left the house than that soldier consumed in an entire day. And yet he ran. He marched. He fought. He dug trenches and crawled through mud and carried his wounded comrades, and did all of this on a diet that, by modern nutritional standards, was somewhere between severely inadequate and catastrophically deficient. How? How did the human body do this? How did millions of men, across every front of the most destructive war in human history, keep functioning, keep fighting, on food that today's nutritionists would look at with genuine alarm? That is the question at the heart of this video. And to answer it properly, we need to go deep. We need to look at what soldiers from different armies actually ate day by day, calorie by calorie. We need to understand what those calories were doing inside their bodies and what was happening when there weren't enough of them. We need to compare those wartime rations to what you can buy today for the least money possible, to rice and black beans and oatmeal and eggs and a loaf of bread from the discount shelf, and figure out what that comparison actually tells us about food, survival, and the extraordinary, terrifying resilience of the human body when it has no other choice. Because here is the thing that this story keeps coming back to, the thing that makes it so difficult to absorb from the comfort of the modern world. The soldiers of World War II were not superhuman. They were not built differently than we are. They had the same basic metabolic needs, the same muscles and organs and hunger pangs and fatigue. What was different was the situation they were in, the absence of alternatives, and what the human body can do when survival is the only option on the table. Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who understood military logistics the hard way, is credited with saying that an army marches on its stomach. He wasn't being poetic. He was stating a fact that every military commander from the Roman legions to the campaigns of World War II had to grapple with in practical terms every single day. You cannot fight if you cannot move. You cannot move if you do not have energy. Energy comes from food. Therefore, food is not a comfort or a luxury. Food is a weapon. The side that feeds its soldiers better wins. Or at the very least, the side that fails to feed its soldiers at all loses. So let's begin at the beginning. What did a soldier actually need? And what did he actually get? The mathematics of survival. What a soldier's body actually needed. Before we can talk about what soldiers ate, we need to understand the brutal arithmetic of what a fighting man's body demanded during World War II. Because the gap between what was needed and what was provided is a central story here, and it is a gap that killed people just as surely as bullets did. A modern adult male living a relatively sedentary life, office work, light walking, sitting at a desk, burns somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 calories per day. That is the baseline of human metabolic function at low activity. It is what keeps your heart beating, your brain thinking, your body temperature stable, your organs functioning. Below that number, your body begins to consume itself. Above it, and you are building tissue, maintaining energy reserves, functioning at capacity. Now take that same adult male and put him in a combat infantry unit. Change his sedentary office life into the following daily schedule. A forced march of anywhere from 10 to 30 kilometers, carrying 30 to 45 kilograms of equipment. Then 4 to 8 hours of digging defensive positions into frozen or rocky ground. Then standing watches through the night in sub-zero temperatures. then a firefight that dumped enough adrenaline into a system to run a car engine, then do it again tomorrow. The caloric demands of that life are staggering. Research on energy expenditure during military training and combat operations, studies conducted both during and after World War II, and confirmed repeatedly in the decades since, puts the daily caloric need of a combat infantry soldier in intense operations at somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 calories per day. In extreme conditions, winter campaigns, mountain warfare, sustained high-tempo combat, that figure can push as high as 7,000 calories daily. To put that in context, that is a caloric expenditure of a Tour de France cyclist during a race stage. It is the energy budget of a professional endurance athlete performing at maximum output. It is the body of a 22-year-old being asked to do the work of an engine day after day, often while terrified, always while sleep-deprived, frequently while ill. The U.S. Army itself recognized this problem and raised its official energy requirement standard to 3,600 calories per day for physically active personnel in 1947, after the war, when researchers had finally had the chance to properly study what had happened to soldiers' bodies. During the war itself, the Army's various ration systems were designed to provide somewhere between 2,800 and 3,600 calories on paper. In practice, under field conditions, in the heat and chaos and supply disruption of actual combat, soldiers frequently received and consumed significantly less. The American military's own field reports from Italy in 1943 noted that nearly every soldier questioned in infantry units said he had lost weight since the campaign began. The official reports from Merrill's marauders in Burma, men who were living on K-rations supplemented by local rice for months, documented an average weight loss of 35 pounds, roughly 16 kilograms per man. An average of 35 pounds gone from a body that was simultaneously being asked to perform at maximum physical output every single day for the German soldier on the Eastern Front in the later years of the war. And for the Soviet soldier throughout most of it, the numbers were even worse. For the Japanese soldier in the Pacific, especially as Allied naval superiority began to strangle supply lines, the situation became one of the most severe nutritional disasters in modern military history, with entire divisions reduced to foraging for roots and insects. And for the ordinary civilian, the person at home, not even fighting, just trying to survive, the food situation across occupied Europe and the Soviet Union was frequently one that crossed the clinical boundary from hunger into genuine starvation. How does a body keep going under these conditions? That is the question. And the answer, which we will come to, is both remarkable and deeply disturbing. The American GI, the best-fed soldier in the war? Let's start with the best-case scenario, because in the context of World War II military nutrition, the American soldier was, by most measures, the most generously supplied fighting man in the conflict. This doesn't mean he ate well by civilian standards, or that he didn't lose weight, or that the food wasn't frequently terrible. It means that compared to what was happening to soldiers in every other major army of the war, the American GI was, on balance, better fed. The U.S. military by 1942 had developed a sophisticated system of different ration types designed for different situations. Understanding this system is important, because what American soldiers ate varied enormously depending on whether they were in a garrison dining hall in England, on a landing craft approaching a beach, or deep in the jungle of the South Pacific. At the top of the hierarchy was the A-ration, fresh food, prepared in a full military kitchen. Fresh meat, vegetables, bread, coffee, fruit, the kind of food that a cook could actually do something with. This was what soldiers ate when they were in base camps or garrison situations, and it was, by the standards of the time and the circumstances, genuinely decent. It provided adequate calories and a reasonable range of nutrients, and it kept soldiers in good condition for the periods when they could access it. The B ration was essentially the same categories of food, but in canned form, designed for situations where fresh supply was impractical, but kitchen facilities were still available. The food was less appealing than the A ration, but nutritionally similar. Then came the C ration and the K ration. The combat rations, the ones that most people associate with American soldiers in World War II, the ones that appear in photographs and memoirs and Hollywood films. These were designed for situations where a soldier might be cut off from any kitchen support for days or weeks at a time. They were portable, durable, and designed to be eaten cold if necessary. The K-ration consisted of two 12-ounce cans per meal unit, one containing a main course such as meat and beans, meat and vegetable stew, or spaghetti, and one containing supplemental items like hard biscuits, a small amount of candy, instant coffee, sugar, and cigarettes. A full day's K-rations, breakfast, dinner, supper, provided approximately 2,794 calories and 121 grams of protein. On paper, this was adequate for a moderately active soldier. For a combat infantryman burning 4,000 to 6,000 calories a day, it was roughly half of what he needed. The K-ration, developed by a University of Minnesota physiologist named in cell keys specifically for paratroopers. The K stood for keys, was even more compact and designed for absolute portability. It came in 3 separate boxes, one for breakfast, one for dinner, one for supper, each small enough to fit in a jacket pocket. A complete day's K-rations provided 2,830 calories and 79 grams of protein. It contained items familiar from civilian life, at least in spirit if not in taste. The breakfast unit included chopped ham and eggs in a small can, crackers, a fruit bar, instant coffee, sugar tablets for cigarettes, and a piece of gum. The dinner unit substituted processed American cheese for the meat and dextrose tablets for the fruit bar. The supper unit contained a beef and pork loaf, bouillon powder, chocolate, and cigarettes. A 1943 Army field report from the European theater was blunt about the limitations of these rations. None of the packaged combat rations were recommended for continuous use by active troops for more than 10 days. After 10 days, the report found soldiers were losing significant body weight and showing signs of nutritional deficiency. The problem was not simply calories, though the calorie shortage was real and serious. The problem was also monotony, which reduced how much soldiers actually chose to eat. The problem was the stress and distraction of combat, which suppressed appetite at exactly the moments when the body most needed fuel. And the problem was that the gap between what the rations provided and what the body actually demanded in high-intensity combat was simply enormous. Inside those C and K rations, though, were items that would go on to become global cultural touchstones. The soldiers who received M&M candies in their C rations were eating the product of a deal struck between Forrest Mars and the Hershey Corporation specifically to supply the U.S. military with a candy that wouldn't melt in heat. Nescafe instant coffee, which Nestle had developed and begun supplying to American forces in 1941, created a generation of instant coffee drinkers who brought the habit home with them and changed the coffee culture of the United States permanently. Spam, the tinned pork product from Hormel Foods that the military contracted to supply in enormous quantities, became so embedded in the food cultures of places like Hawaii, the Philippines, and Guam, where American forces were stationed and where Spam was shared with local populations, that it remains a beloved ingredient in regional cuisine to this day. The American ration system was also notable for something that no other major army of the war managed at scale: systematic vitamin supplementation. As the science of nutrition developed during the war years, vitamins had only been properly understood since the early decades of the 20th century. American military nutritionists worked to ensure that the rations contained adequate vitamins A and C, adding supplements where the natural food content fell short. This was not a trivial concern. Vitamin deficiency diseases, scurvy from lack of vitamin C, pellagra from lack of niacin, beriberi from lack of thiamine, had historically devastated armies operating on limited diets, and the U.S. Army was determined to avoid that particular disaster. They did not entirely succeed. Soldiers who relied on K-rations for extended periods in Burma and other theaters showed clear vitamin deficiencies. But the systematic attempt to address the problem nutritionally at an institutional level was unique to the American military and reflects the degree to which the United States brought its industrial and scientific capabilities to bear on the problem of feeding an army. The German soldier, iron rations in the goulash cannon. The German Wehrmacht soldier World War II began the war with a ration system that was, in its design, genuinely impressive. German military planners and nutritionists had put considerable scientific thought into the question of how to fuel a frontline soldier, and the early war German ration was designed to provide around 4,500 calories per day for a frontline fighter, more on paper than the American K or C rations were offering, and thoughtfully assembled to provide a range of macronutrients. At the core of the German field ration system was the concept of the halbe Zern, the half-iron ration. This was the emergency reserve that every soldier carried on his person at all times. One 300-gram tin of preserved meat, which would be pork, beef, turkey, or chicken, and one 125 to 150-gram unit of hard bread called Hartzwieback, a dense, dry biscuit that could survive months of rough treatment in a pack. Alongside this was the Erbswurst, one of the most clever pieces of field food ever developed, a condensed piece soup compressed into a hard pellet form, packaged 6 to a ration. A soldier would crumble a pellet into half a pint of boiling water, wait 1 minute, and have a hot, protein-rich soup. Simple, durable, calorically dense, genuinely nutritious. The Erbswurst had been part of the German military diet since the Wars of Unification in the 19th century, and it remained a reliable staple through both world wars. The German army also invested heavily in mobile field kitchens, the Feldküchen, which gave rise to the soldiers' slang term Galashkanon, the goulash cannon, for the tall stove-piped mobile cooking units that traveled with units and could prepare hot meals even while on the move. These kitchens represented a genuine logistical commitment to keeping soldiers fed with hot food, and in the early years of the war, when the Wehrmacht was advancing rapidly across Poland, France, and the Balkans, the system worked reasonably well. The German army's bread supply was also a point of cultural and practical significance. German military bread came in several varieties. Knackebrot was a hard, crisp whole wheat cracker. Hartzwieback was a harder biscuit mentioned above, and standard rye bread, when available, was a dense, dark, sour loaf with a caloric density and a shelf life significantly better than the soft white bread that American soldiers were more familiar with. German soldiers were culturally accustomed to rye bread as a staple food in a way that many American soldiers were not, and this cultural alignment between the ration and the palate is a factor that nutritional planners often overlook. Food that soldiers will actually eat is more valuable than food they reject. For the Wehrmacht soldier on the Western and Northern fronts through 1941, the system worked. For the soldier who crossed into the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, as part of Operation Barbarossa, the story became progressively darker. The Eastern Front broke the German supply system in ways that its designers had never anticipated. The sheer scale of the geography, the staggering distances that supply lines needed to cover across roads that were often no more than unpaved tracks, through mud seasons that could swallow vehicles whole, in winters of severity that Central European soldiers had never experienced, meant that maintaining the designed ration scale became increasingly impossible. By the winter of 1941 to 1942, German soldiers on the Eastern Front were frequently receiving significantly less than their designed rations. By the middle years of the war, the German army was increasingly dependent on looting food from occupied territories, and entire units were instructed to live off the land, a euphemism for taking food from the civilian populations they were occupying. The deliberate exploitation of Soviet food resources was, in fact, a central element of Nazi economic planning from before the invasion. The Hungerplan, developed by Nazi agricultural officials in May of 1941, explicitly projected that tens of millions of Soviet citizens would die of starvation as a result of food being redirected to the German military and German civilians. This was not a regrettable side effect of military necessity. It was deliberate policy. The historian Timothy Snyder estimated that 4.2 million Soviet citizens were starved by German occupiers between 1941 and 1944. Soviet prisoners of war received official rations of 2,200 calories per day, already inadequate for a working man, but in practice often received only 700 calories, a subsistence ration that the German army itself described using that clinical term, while knowing perfectly well it was a death sentence on a slightly extended timeline. By the late war years, the German soldiers' own diet had deteriorated severely. Bread was being supplemented with ersatz fillers, ground acorns, chicory, even with flour in some extreme cases. Coffee was made from roasted barley and beech nuts. The comprehensive nutritional system that had begun the war as scientifically designed and carefully planned had collapsed under the weight of the catastrophic military situation, and the soldiers of the Wehrmacht in 1944 and 1945 were frequently as hungry and malnourished as the enemies they were fighting. The Soviet soldier, black bread, kasha, and 100 grams of vodka, Of all the major armies of World War II, the Red Army soldier's food story is perhaps the most raw and the most difficult to read, because it is a story of genuine, sustained, catastrophic deprivation for millions of people over years, punctuated by moments of improvisation and human ingenuity that are as moving as they are heartbreaking. The official field ration scale for a Red Army soldier, established in 1941, looked, on paper, relatively comprehensive. A soldier in summer was entitled to 800 grams of rye bread per day, rising to 900 grams in winter, when caloric needs increased due to the cold. He was also entitled to approximately 500 grams of potatoes, 320 grams of other vegetables, 170 grams of grain or pasta, 150 grams of meat, 100 grams of fish, 50 grams of fats, and 35 grams of sugar. On paper, this added up to somewhere around 3,000 to 3,500 calories, which was at least in the range of what a soldier needed for moderate activity. The first word in that analysis is doing enormous work. On paper. What the official ration scale said a soldier should receive and what a soldier actually received were, for significant stretches of the war on the Eastern Front, completely different things. The German invasion of June 1941 shattered Soviet logistics over an enormous area. By 1942, with the Germans occupying the most fertile agricultural regions of the country, Ukraine, the Donbass, large swaths of Russia, and with the entire Soviet supply system under crushing pressure from the demands of supporting an army fighting across thousands of kilometers of front, the reality for many Red Army soldiers was significantly below the official scale. The staple that the Soviet soldier depended on above all others was bread, black rye bread, specifically dense, sour, dark, with a smell that is instantly recognizable to anyone who has ever been near it. This bread was caloric by the standards of its volume, containing more protein and fiber than white wheat bread, with a moisture content that made it relatively heavy in a density that made a 900-gram daily ration feel substantial in the hand, even if it didn't feel substantial in the stomach of a man burning for 1,000 calories a day. When bread was available, it was a foundation of survival. When it was not available, soldiers searched for anything that could substitute. The other anchor of the Soviet soldier's diet was kasha, a word that translates broadly as porridge, but which in the Russian military context referred specifically to cooked grain, usually buckwheat, barley, or millet, cooked in a field kitchen until it was thick and hot and served into mess tins. Kasha was calorie-dense relative to its cost, filling in the sense that it expanded in the stomach, and if it was cooked with fat, a spoonful of lard, a bit of rendered animal fat. It became genuinely nourishing in a way that plain grain porridge was not. Soviet military cooks became extraordinarily skilled at extracting nutrition from limited ingredients. They made soups from vegetable scraps that would have been discarded in peacetime. They found ways to add caloric density to thin rations by adding whatever fat was available. They adapted and improvised constantly. Perhaps the most famous element of the Soviet soldier's ration was what he did not always receive but was officially supposed to the People's Commissar's 100 grams. In August of 1941, Joseph Stalin signed an order providing every Red Army soldier with 100 grams of vodka per day, a measure that had both practical and psychological justifications in the minds of Soviet military planners. In practice, the vodka was not always available, and when it was, its distribution was often irregular, used as a reward for specific actions rather than as a daily entitlement. But the idea of it, the promise of it, was significant. It was an acknowledgement that men in these conditions needed something beyond mere fuel. They needed something that was, in the most direct sense, a comfort. The situation was most acute in 1941 and 1942, when the combination of military catastrophe, supply system collapse, and the massive territorial losses meant that many Soviet soldiers were genuinely surviving on caloric intakes that would cause rapid and serious deterioration. Starvation tuberculosis, a disease that results specifically from a weakening of the immune system through severe malnutrition, became the leading cause of death from illness in some eastern industrial cities during this period. Soldiers who were issued rations were in better shape than the civilians around them, but that is a statement about the depth of civilian suffering rather than the adequacy of military feeding. What partially saved the Red Army's food situation from 1943 onwards was Lend-Lease, the American supply program that shipped enormous quantities of food to the Soviet Union alongside military equipment. Canned meat, including Spam, which Soviet soldiers called the Second Front with dark humor, acknowledging both its American origin and its arrival in place of actual Allied military action in the West, arrived in quantities that genuinely supplemented and partially offset the caloric shortfall. Canned sausages, powdered eggs, flour, sugar, powdered milk, and lard arrived in ships that crossed the North Atlantic under German submarine attack. The fact that Soviet soldiers were eating American canned meat in Stalingrad and Kursk is one of the stranger and less told stories of the war's logistics. Soviet soldiers also showed a remarkable culture of resourcefulness in their relationship with food. They kept small, smooth stones in their mouths during long marches to stimulate saliva and reduce the sensation of thirst. They chewed pine needles to prevent scurvy, a traditional Russian practice that military doctors actively encouraged after the siege of Leningrad made vitamin C deficiency a serious threat. They traded captured German rations, which were prized for their relative caloric density and variety, particularly the canned meats and chocolate, with the same enthusiasm that American soldiers traded their cigarettes and candy for local food. They maintained small vegetable gardens at base camps when the situation permitted. They relied on local civilians, who had almost nothing themselves but would often share hot potatoes or fresh eggs with the soldiers who passed through their villages, a gesture of solidarity between equally hungry people that is documented in countless memoirs from both sides of that transaction. What starvation does to a fighting man, the science of running on empty. We've been talking about food, but what we are really talking about is what happens inside a human body when that food falls below what the body needs. Because the most important question this whole story raises, how do they run 10 kilometers on a handful of bread and some thin soup, is fundamentally a question about human physiology, about what the body does when it has no choice but to keep going. The first thing to understand is how the body manages energy under shortage conditions. When caloric intake falls below what energy expenditure demands, the body does not simply shut down. It enters what physiologists call a catabolic state, a condition where it begins to break down its own stored energy reserves to continue functioning. The first reserves to go are the glycogen stores in the liver and muscles, carbohydrate energy that is held in a form available for immediate use. Under normal conditions, a person has enough glycogen stored to fuel about 90 minutes of moderate exercise before those stores are depleted. When glycogen runs low, the body shifts to burning fat. Body fat is a remarkably efficient energy storage medium. A kilogram of body fat contains roughly 7,700 calories of stored energy, and the human body can access this energy through a process called lipolysis, breaking down fat molecules into fatty acids that the muscles can burn directly. This is what happens during the early stages of a calorie deficit. The body burns fat, and if there is enough fat to begin with, performance can be maintained at a somewhat reduced level for a surprisingly long time. The problem comes when fat stores are depleted. At that point, the body begins breaking down muscle protein, its own structural tissue, to use as fuel. This is a process of muscle wasting, and it is genuinely catastrophic for physical performance. Muscle is not just fuel. It is the mechanism of movement. When you burn muscle to stay alive, you are dismantling the machinery while trying to run the engine. The soldiers of Merrill's marauders, who lost an average of 35 pounds each over 5 months in Burma, were not losing that weight in body fat alone. They were losing muscle tissue, and the physical decline that accompanied that loss was measurable and severe. By the time the unit reached its final objective at Myitkyina, many men could barely walk. Some were suffering from multiple simultaneous diseases, malaria, dysentery, typhus, that their compromised immune systems could no longer adequately resist. Beyond the physical mechanics, starvation does something even more insidious to the mind. The psychological impact of chronic food deprivation is profound and well documented. Studies of severely food-restricted individuals consistently find that hunger becomes all-consuming, crowding out other thoughts and concerns. Decision-making quality deteriorates. Emotional regulation becomes difficult. Irritability, depression, and anxiety all increase. The famous Minnesota Starvation Experiment of 1944 conducted a study of the physiological and psychological effects of severe caloric restriction, specifically to help Allied forces understand what they would find when liberating concentration camp prisoners, documented that even moderately food-restricted men, who were receiving about half of their normal caloric intake, became obsessively preoccupied with food within weeks. They dreamed about food. They talked about food constantly. They collected recipes they had no means of preparing. Food became the central organizing principle of their psychological lives. For soldiers in the field, dealing with the psychological state, while simultaneously being asked to make tactical decisions, maintain unit cohesion, care for wounded comrades, and face an enemy trying to kill them, the burden was immense. The soldiers who functioned best under these conditions were often those with the greatest physical reserves going in, the ones who arrived in good nutritional condition and had fat and muscle to burn before the critical deterioration began. This is one reason why the progressive decline in physical fitness and nutrition of German and Soviet forces, as the war went on, had such direct operational consequences. An army of hungry, malnourished soldiers is not simply an army fighting at reduced effectiveness. It is an army that is losing, in the most literal biological sense, the capacity to fight at all. And yet they kept going. Starving men crossed frozen rivers and assaulted fortified positions and crawled through minefields and did all the physically impossible things that the historical record says they did. The answer to how is partly adrenaline. The stress hormones that the human body dumps into the system in life-threatening situations create a temporary mobilization of energy reserves that can produce extraordinary short-term performance. The fight-or-flight response doesn't check your blood glucose before it activates. It overrides a sensation of exhaustion and hunger with a flood of chemicals that turn the body into, temporarily, a performance machine regardless of its nutritional state. But adrenaline is a loan, not a gift. The performance enables comes with biological debt that has to be repaid when the immediate threat passes. And for soldiers who were in states of continuous, weeks-long stress, whose bodies were never given a chance to recover, to sleep enough, to eat enough, to allow the adrenal glands to rest, the debt accumulated until it could no longer be serviced. Today's cheapest food, the real comparison. Now, let's bring this conversation into the present, because the title of this video poses comparison, a World War II soldier's diet versus today's cheapest food, and it's a comparison that deserves to be taken seriously, not as a gimmick, but as a genuine investigation into what has changed and what hasn't. What are the cheapest foods available today, measured in cost per calorie? The answer, when you actually run the numbers, is both obvious and instructive. Brown rice sits at approximately 5 cents per 100 calories, essentially the cheapest meaningful food source available in most of the developed world. A kilogram of brown rice, costing perhaps $1 to $2 depending on where you shop, contains around 3,600 calories. Dried oats are similarly cheap, roughly 9 cents per 100 calories, and a large 42-ounce container of plain rolled oats can be purchased for under $3, providing thousands of calories in a form that can be eaten hot or cold, that has a long shelf life, and that provides a genuinely decent nutritional profile, including protein, fiber, and various B vitamins. Dried lentils and beans, black beans, chickpeas, pinto beans, red lentils, are among the most nutritionally complete cheap foods available, providing not just calories but substantial protein and fiber at costs of roughly 15 to 20 cents per 100 calories. A kilogram of dried lentils costing $2 provides around 3,500 calories and approximately 90 grams of protein, making it one of the most efficient combinations of calories, protein, and cost available anywhere. Eggs are extraordinary value from a nutritional standpoint. A dozen large eggs can be purchased in the United States for under $2 in many stores, providing roughly 960 calories and 72 grams of high-quality protein. Protein, that is, in terms of biological availability and amino acid completeness, some of the best available in any food. The cost per 100 calories for eggs works out to roughly 17 cents, but the nutritional return on that investment is far higher than the calorie count alone suggests. White bread, a basic supermarket loaf, costs around $2.50 and provides approximately 1,200 to 1,400 calories, depending on the size, working out to roughly 11 cents per 100 calories. It is not a nutritionally complete food. White bread is primarily simple carbohydrates with relatively little protein, minimal fat, and limited micronutrients. But in terms of raw caloric provision at low cost, it does its job. Vegetable oil, canola oil, sunflower oil, cheap cooking oil of any kind, is the most calorie-dense cheap food available. providing 120 calories per tablespoon and costing roughly 3 cents per 100 calories. It has essentially no nutritional value beyond calories and fat, but as a way to add caloric density to otherwise low-calorie foods. It is without equal. Now here's a striking comparison. If you assembled a daily diet from these cheapest available foods, targeting the caloric needs of a moderately active adult, say 2,500 calories, you could do it for somewhere between $1 and $2 per day. A cup of oats for breakfast, a big pot of rice and lentils for the main meal of the day, a cup of eggs, some cheap bread, a tablespoon or two of oil in the cooking. 2,500 calories, adequate protein, reasonable fiber, basic nutrition, for $1 to $2. Now scale that up to the 4,500 to 6,000 calories that a combat soldier needed, at the same cost per calorie ratios. You're looking at roughly $3 to $5 per day to meet the caloric demands of hard physical activity. Still extraordinarily cheap by the standards of what most people in the developed world spend on food. How does this compare to what World War II soldiers were actually receiving in terms of caloric provision on paper? The official ration scales. The American soldier was receiving something comparable to what today's cheapest diet could provide, though often with worse variety and palatability. The German soldier's early war ration was actually more generous in caloric terms than what today's cheapest food budget can provide, reflecting genuine institutional investment in soldier nutrition. The Soviet soldier's official scale was adequate. The actual delivery was often not. But here is a critical insight that this comparison reveals. The food itself, rice, bread, beans, oats, is not the limiting factor. It never was. The limiting factor was always logistics, always the supply chain, always whether the food that existed somewhere in the rear could actually reach the man in the trench or the jungle or the frozen steppe. Today, you can buy 4,500 calories worth of food for a few dollars and eat it in the comfort of your home. In 1943 on the Eastern Front, the food that was theoretically supposed to reach the soldier was being consumed by the distance between the supply depot and the front line, by the destroyed bridges, by the mud-swallowed roads, by the partisan activity cutting supply lines, by the chaos of a military situation that had long since stopped resembling any plan. The cheapness of calories was never the problem. The delivery was always the problem. How did they run 10 kilometers on black bread? The full answer. We've been circling around the core question of this video long enough. Let's answer it directly. How did a Soviet soldier, eating 800 grams of black bread, a handful of vegetables, and a thin bowl of kasha per day, actually run across a battlefield? How did he do a forced march of 20 kilometers in minus 20-degree cold, carrying 30 kilograms of equipment? How did a German soldier, who hadn't had a hot meal in 4 days, assault a fortified Soviet position? How did American Marines, who had been living on K-rations for weeks in the Pacific jungle fight engagements against a determined enemy on Guadalcanal? The answer has several components, and none of them are comfortable because none of them are about the food being adequate. The food was not adequate. The bodies were being systematically damaged by insufficient nutrition. What kept those bodies moving was a combination of biology, psychology, culture, and the absolute absence of any alternative. The biology first. The human body's stress response system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the sympathetic nervous system, the cocktail of hormones, including cortisol and adrenaline, that the body produces in response to threat, is one of the most powerful performance-enhancing systems in nature. When a person genuinely believes they are about to be killed, the body responds in ways that temporarily override many of the normal physiological limitations. Pain signals are suppressed. Fatigue signals are suppressed. Energy that would normally be unavailable is mobilized. Focus narrows to the immediate threat. The body becomes, for a few minutes or a few hours, capable of things that it could not do in a normal state. This is well documented in the accounts of soldiers who performed extraordinary physical feats in combat. The man who ran across open ground under fire after 4 days without proper sleep and 2 days without a full meal was not running on the nutrition in his system. He was running on the most primal biological imperative that evolution ever designed. Do not die. The body will consume itself to honor that imperative. It will burn through its last fat reserves, break down its own muscle protein, push past any threshold of physical endurance, to keep a person moving when the alternative is to stop and be killed. Then there is adaptation. The human body is remarkably good at adapting to reduce caloric intake over time. Basal metabolic rate, the minimum energy the body needs to maintain basic functions, is not fixed. In response to chronic caloric restriction, the body downregulates many of its energy-consuming processes. It becomes more efficient. It does more with less. This is not a comfortable process. It involves losing muscle mass, reducing activity levels, slowing digestion, decreasing body temperature, reducing non-essential biological functions. But it allows survival at caloric intakes that would, in the short term, be catastrophic. The human body spent millions of years of evolution in environments where food was frequently scarce, and it carries the adaptations of all those hungry ancestors. The cultural component is perhaps the most underappreciated. Men who grew up in cultures where hardship and food scarcity were normal, who had grown up in poor agricultural communities in Russia or Germany or Poland, where a hard winter could mean genuine hunger, brought to war a psychological relationship with food deprivation that was fundamentally different from someone who had never gone truly hungry in their life. Hunger, for these men, was not an emergency. It was a familiar condition, one they had survived before and knew, at some level, how to endure. The Soviet soldier who grew up in a collective farm village during the severe food shortages of the early 1930s had learned, at a cellular level, that hunger was something you pushed through. That was the lived experience he brought to the Eastern Front. And finally, the most difficult element to discuss, but the most honest, there is a compulsion of the alternative. No one was running across that battlefield because they wanted to. No one was making that forced march because it sounded appealing. They were doing it because not doing it meant being shot as a deserter, or being captured by an enemy who had demonstrated what they did with prisoners, or leaving the men next to them to die alone. The human capacity for endurance in the face of catastrophic alternatives is something that peacetime life almost never tests. War tests it constantly. The men who crossed those battlefields on black bread and thin soup were not doing something superhuman. They were doing something deeply, specifically human. They were surviving, by any means necessary, in the only way available to them. What this tells us, the lessons of wartime hunger for the modern world. We live in an era of extraordinary food abundance. In the developed world, the challenge for most people is not finding enough calories. It is navigating a landscape of such caloric excess that the health consequences of overconsumption have become one of the defining public health crises of the 21st century. The average supermarket carries tens of thousands of distinct food products. A budget of a few dollars can buy enough calories to sustain a person for a day. Food is cheap, available, varied, and, by any historical standard, miraculous in its convenience and consistency. The soldiers of World War II would have found the situation literally unimaginable, not metaphorically. Literally impossible to imagine from within the lived reality of 1942 or 1943. A Soviet soldier eating his 800 grams of black bread in a frozen trench outside Stalingrad, knowing that it was all he would receive that day and that tomorrow might bring even less, could not have conceptualized what would feel like to live in a world where the problem with food was not scarcity, but choice. The comparison between wartime rations and today's cheapest food is ultimately not just a nutritional comparison. It is a comparison of two entirely different relationships between humans and the thing that keeps them alive. In wartime, that relationship was raw and unmediated. Food was survival, visible in its inadequacy, felt in its absence, valued with intensity that no amount of abundance can reproduce. Today, that relationship has been, for most people in wealthy countries, almost entirely severed from its biological foundation. We eat not primarily to survive, but for pleasure, convenience, social connection, habit. The survival mathematics that govern every calorie calculation on the Eastern Front or in the Pacific are simply not visible in the daily food decisions of someone choosing between the pasta and the salad for lunch. This is not a moral failing. It is an extraordinary achievement of civilization that we have managed to push survival so far from the center of daily life that most people in the developed world never have to think about it. The soldiers of World War II would not want us to go hungry in their memory. They endured what they endured so that the generations after them would not have to. But there is something important in understanding what those bodies went through. There is something important in knowing that a combat soldier in 1943 was burning 4,000 to 6,000 calories a day and often receiving fewer than 3,000, and kept fighting anyway. There is something important in understanding that the human body, pushed to its absolute limit by hunger and cold and fear and exhaustion, contains reserves that comfortable modern life never touches and never has to touch. That the 800 grams of black bread and a handful of vegetables were not enough, and the men knew it was enough, and they ran anyway. Because the question of how they ran across the battlefield on black bread and a handful of vegetables is ultimately not a question about food. It is a question about human beings, about what we carry inside us that doesn't show up on a nutrition label. The stubbornness, the loyalty, the terror, the love for the men beside us, the determination to be still alive when this particular day ends. Those things are not macronutrients. You cannot measure them in calories or grams of protein. But they fueled more miles of forced marches and more desperate assaults across open ground than any ration system ever designed. The soldiers who made it through that war carried the cost of it in their bodies for the rest of their lives. The weight loss, the vitamin deficiencies, the muscle wasting, these left physical marks that many veterans carried into old age. But they fueled more miles of forced marches and more desperate assaults across open ground than any ration system ever designed. The soldiers who made it through that war carried the cost of it in their bodies for the rest of their lives. The weight loss, the vitamin deficiencies, the muscle wasting, these left physical marks that many veterans carried into old age. But they also carried something else, the knowledge, at a level deeper than conscious thought, of what it means to be genuinely hungry and keep going. That knowledge is one of the most valuable and most inaccessible things that history has to teach us, because it requires a situation that we should be grateful every single day, never to have to learn firsthand. That's the story of what soldiers ate in World War II. And perhaps more importantly, it's the story of what they did when what they ate was nowhere near enough. If this video made you think differently about food, about history, or about what human beings are capable when the alternative is unacceptable, if it taught you something you hadn't known before, please hit that subscribe button and leave us a like. This channel exists to tell these stories in the depth and honesty they deserve. If you know someone who would find value in this, a history buff, a fitness enthusiast, anyone curious about the intersection of biology and war, share it with them. Every view helps these stories reach the people who deserve to hear them. We'll see you in the next one.